When I first start working with a new student, I often find that making a few small adjustments can have a massive impact within just a week or two. So in this video, I'm going to share some of that low-hanging fruit you might be experiencing in your LSAT prep as well. And if you take one of these insights, apply it in just a week or two, you may see an increase of 5-10 points or more as well. I'll go over examples in each of logical reasoning, reading comprehension, and logic games. In logical reasoning, for example, one of the biggest misconceptions I see students facing is failing to distinguish between necessary assumption questions and sufficient assumption questions. They both have the word assumption, but they're referring to radically different things. First off, you tell the difference between them based on the key word or phrase in the question stem. Words and phrases synonymous with necessity are, of course, associated with necessary assumption questions. And in contrast, words and phrases synonymous with sufficiency are associated with, you guessed it, sufficient assumption questions. And so you want to make sure you're crystal clear on the key difference in identifying necessary assumption versus sufficient assumption questions. Now, of course, you approach these types in different ways as well. For necessary assumption questions, you can use the so-called negation technique or denial test as you run through the answer choices. In other words, the correct answer choice, when negated, will destroy the argument, leaving no ambiguity at all. For sufficient assumption questions, in contrast, you're looking for new information that, if true, will guarantee the argument's validity 100%, leaving no ambiguity at all. So again, necessary assumption questions, the answer must be true. It is required, which is why, in fact, necessary assumption questions are best viewed as a very specific kind of must be true question. Now, a lot of the other LSAT prep companies out there will disagree with me on this. I stand firm. If it's required by the argument, then in fact, it must be true. And so the necessary assumption isn't actually new information. In contrast, of course, sufficient assumption questions open the door to new information that, if true, guarantees the argument, leaving no ambiguity at all. And so it doesn't matter how extreme the answer choice is for a sufficient assumption question. Bottom line is, if we assumed it to be true, it would guarantee the argument, leaving no ambiguity, totally sufficient to require the argument. So make sure that you are clear on the key difference between necessary assumption questions and sufficient assumption questions. And if your LSAT prep book or LSAT prep course refers to them under the catch-all category of assumption, throw it out or give it to your worst enemy. Now, for reading comprehension, too many students get bogged down in the details of the passage text and then don't have enough time to solve the questions associated. You're dealing with a passage of roughly 450 words of dense, difficult information on a topic that you have probably no prior familiarity with. And so it's not reasonable to think that you're going to digest everything in the passage on your initial read. That's okay. You don't have to. Instead, focus on getting down just what is the main idea, what is the primary purpose, what is the author's opinion, and leave it at that. Use that key takeaway to help you solve all the general global questions. The details, the supporting examples, you can always go back to the passage later to find that information when you need it, but you don't need to get bogged down on it during your initial read. If you think about it, you have roughly 8 minutes and 45 seconds to approach both the passage and the questions associated. Of course, it's just an average. Some will be easier and take less time. Others will be harder and take more time. That's okay. But if you spend any more than 3 minutes on your initial read of the passage, you're not going to have enough time to solve the questions associated. So cut off after 3 minutes, note what the main idea is, solve those general global questions, and then go back and solve all the detail-oriented questions that refer you back to the passage. And then finally, solve the more inferential questions that require a bit more between the lines reading. And so you'll notice here, I'm recommending that you approach the questions in a reading comp set out of order, not in the order that they give it to you in. Same, by the way, goes for logic games. For logic games, you also want to approach the questions out of order, because if you start with the local if questions, you then build up a library of hypothetical scenarios that you can then use to help you solve the more general global questions that ask you which one of the following must be true or which one of the following could be true. Don't do the global ones before the local ones, because the work you're doing for the local will then make it that much easier to solve the global question. So again, approach logic games questions out of order as well within a set. You also want to take the time to slow down and make more inferences up front. Don't just jump into the questions on logic games, because the inferences that you make are, after all, what LSAT is testing your ability to do. They don't want to just see, can you brute force it and try out all 5 choices mechanically? That's not nearly as impressive to them to have you solve it like a calculator, when instead you can solve it more inferentially, more deductively, meaning that you're using your higher level skills to make those inferences up front. So again, there we have it: logical reasoning, necessary assumption versus sufficient assumption questions, reading comp, less time on the passage, more on the questions, approach the questions out of order, in the order that is strategic for you, and then logic games, same deal, approach the questions out of order and take the time to slow down and make more inferences up front. If you found this video helpful, I share more insights like this inside the LSAT Unplugged prep courses, where we have live online classes via Zoom, on-demand video courses, small group coaching, and one-on-one coaching to help you score in the 170s. If you found the video helpful, please do me a favor and share it with someone who needs to see it. And in the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.